Hi, I'm John Ed Mathison, and thank you for this privilege of sharing with you about a Bible study and what it teaches us about how we can live our lives effectively every day. We've been in a tough time, and we're doing things so much differently, and so this will be a kind of time of teaching and sharing from my own heart. Ellen Pollock, I appreciate the invitation from her. I was out in Jonesboro, Arkansas when she was on the staff there. I think she was in college at that time, and I had a chance to meet her and be with her, and I know she's doing a great job. And many folks I know are now at the villages. I'd like to begin in this first session deal with how do you face a giant in life? How do you face it? And that's what we're facing, the giant of the pandemic, the coronavirus. I mean, that's a giant, and it seems to get bigger and bigger all the time. We also are facing just fragile race relations and the things that are going on in our country and our nation. We're also facing the whole idea with the economy and what's going to happen to schools, football, high school sports. I've got two grandsons who just graduated from high school this year. Both of them are athletes. Both of them are looking forward to a senior year. And much of what they did got canceled in track and in baseball. And they had to delay their graduation for about 6 weeks. I mean, we're facing some big things. How do you face big things in life? Now, I'd like to just sort of walk through how one man did that, and I think it'll give us a way to look at how God can teach us of how we can endure and face and be victorious in tough situations. Now, the Bible study will come from 1 Samuel, the 17th chapter. I'm going to take a man, David, who faced a giant. Now, I don't think there's anybody that's facing giants that are any bigger than David faced. And if he could conquer that giant, whatever it is you face today, large or small, you can be victorious in it. Now, you may not be facing a giant at this moment. I expect you are. If not, you will be real soon. I mean, that's just the nature of life. So let's look at David. And from 1 Samuel, you remember that the Israelites had gone to battle with the Philistines, and the lines of battle had come down to the fact that each was to select one person who would go out and fight. And the Philistines had already selected their man. He was a giant, Goliath. And Israel was trying to figure out who to face. Nobody was volunteering to go out there. And you remember there was a young boy who was the youngest of several brothers. His brothers were at battle, and his daddy said to him, "Why don't you go up and check out the battle?" And you read about that in the earlier chapters here in Samuel. Go out and check it and see what's going on. So he gave him some food. Now, I think he must have been a Methodist, because when you read the amount of food that they put for David to take up to the lines to his brother, I mean, it was an immense amount of food. We Methodists have always been known for having really big times when we eat and the amount of food that we consume. Well, when he got up there, he saw what the battle was about. And he just sort of jokingly said, "Who is this uncircumcised Gentile that's taunting the people of God?" And then they said, "Shh, boy, be quiet, be quiet. That's Goliath. And we're looking for somebody to go out and face him." Now, I want to say to you 5 things that deal with how to face a giant. And David faced a giant in this way. And if you and I do face our giants wherever they are, then I think we can have similar results. I would say to myself and to you, I don't think anybody is facing a giant that's any bigger than David faced. You see, Goliath was 9 feet tall. I mean, that's 2 feet taller than anybody playing in the NBA or the NFL. And he carried a big old material that protected him. It was so heavy, hardly you could walk in it. He carried a spear and a shield, and one of them weighed 200 pounds, the other one 25 pounds. I mean, just to carry that around with us. He was a big, strong man. And when David checked who's going out to face him, they said, "Well, we hadn't decided yet." And David said, "I'll go." Now, think about it for a moment. That put the brothers in a precarious position. They weren't going to go out there And they didn't want their brother to go out and be sacrificed. But given that choice, they said, well, David, maybe you ought to be our representative. And so he gets ready to go out and face the giant. Now, let me walk through 5 things that, I want you to write these down, and there'll be some questions I hope you'll talk about and think about and study those. The first thing I want you to see is attitude. Attitude is so important when you face a giant. An attitude. Let me tell you what I've learned. Attitude, oftentimes towards an event or a situation, is more important than the reality of the situation itself. I've seen some people face a big giant with a great attitude, and they do far better than folks that have a poor attitude trying to face something that's very small. Attitude just sort of sets a pattern of what we're going to do about it. Now, here's the essence of David's attitude. You see it in verse 37. Attitude is based on 2 things. It's based on affirmation of what God has done. Affirmation of what God has done. He said, you remember one day when I was tending the sheep, a bear came and also a lion came, and God gave me the strength to defend and kill both of those. God has already delivered me. Now, let me tell you what an attitude is. An attitude is remembering what God's already done in the past. I hope maybe your group will maybe discuss for a few minutes. Maybe right now you want to just write down some things that God's done in your past. How has He delivered you? What can you affirm that God has done? And an attitude is remembering how big God is. Listen, we tend to remember the bad things. Attitude remembers the good things. It remembers the places where God has delivered us. Now I ask you a question. Where has God delivered you? How does that shape your perspective for today? You might want to talk about that as a group. And then the other part of attitude is not just affirmation, but it's anticipation. He says in verse 37, God will deliver me. Now, an attitude is positive. I can tell you how you go into a situation generally determines, your attitude will determine how it's going to turn out. The Bible says, as a man thinks, so is he. I think it was Ford who once said, Henry Ford said, if you think you're right or if you think you're wrong, you're correct. Generally, how we think determines how we act. And attitude then becomes so very, very important. When you got to face a giant, if you say, I can't do that, you're defeated to start with. If you're willing to face him and then get ready to go forward. So let me just remind you, in the Old Testament, there were some great people who had a great attitude. Remember when the children of Israel came up and they were checking out the promised land, they sent in 12 spies just to check it out. 10 of them came back and their attitude was, we can't do that. There are too many giants there. They formed what I'd call the Back to Egypt Committee. Let's go home. But there were 2 guys. Who were they? Can you name them? Joshua and Caleb. And they came back and said, yeah, they're giants, but God's bigger than the giants. Let's go forward and take the land. I want you just to think about something for a moment. The people accepted the minority report and went forward and took the land. What if they had gone along with the majority that said we can't do it? We probably wouldn't be having a Bible study today. Would the Christian faith even exist? But they went forward and they took the land. How do you look at a situation? What's your attitude? Remember when Jesus was teaching and there were 5,000 folks, nothing to eat? What was the attitude of the disciples? Well, nothing to serve them. What was the attitude Jesus had? What do you have? And he was able to take a little and make a lot out of it because he could see the possibilities. When Andrew brought that little boy, he could see the possibilities of what God can do. The first thing is attitude. What is your attitude? How good is it? I like the lady who was 101 years old. She went to the doctor for an annual checkup. He gave her a clean bill of health. As she started out the door, she said, "I'll see you next year, Doc." He looked at her and said, "Whoa, at 101, you seem to be mighty confident of that fact." She said, "Oh, I am, sir. Very few people die between the ages of 101 and 102. Check your records." Now that is an attitude. What is your attitude when you have to face a giant? Now, the second thing is what I would call assessment, verse 39 and 40. When he got ready to fight, they put all this armor on him and he couldn't even move. He was a little boy. It was too big for him. And he said, "I can't use this. But let me use what I know how to use." And he took out his sling and he found in verse 39, he says, he assessed what he could do. And the two parts of assessment, you got to be accurate. Accurate. What can I do? He said, "I can't go with all of this stuff that y'all are putting on me." He accurately assessed. Let me tell you, you can't do and face a giant like somebody else can. You're not gifted like they are. You can't be like them. He said, "I can't go with these." But the other part of assessing is adapting. Well, what am I going to adapt? What am I going to do? It says he took 5 smooth stones, verse 40, and he went with his sling. Let me do what I believe. You've got a sling, and if you're willing to look for and find the 5 smooth stones, you can see any giant fall. That can just happen. But you've got to use what you have. One of our problems in life and families and church and everything is we try to make people into somebody that God didn't gift them to be. We try to make them like somebody else. Look at your thumbprint for a minute. God didn't give anybody else that thumbprint. I'm that uniquely different. Would you just think maybe and talk about and discuss for a few minutes here, how are you unique? What are your gifts? Would you just take some time and write down, here are the places I'm gifted. I can't wear armor, but I've got a sling. Now, what are my stones? You can't be like somebody else. You can't face something like somebody else does. We do that to our kids sometimes. Why can't you be like your big brother or your big sister? Sometimes in marriage we do that. We say, "Why can't you be like so-and-so's husband or so-and-so's wife?" I heard a cute story about a woman who came up to her husband one day and they had some new neighbors move in next door. And she said to him, why don't you do like that man next door? He said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, why don't you watch him in the morning? As he gets ready to leave, he kisses his wife on the steps. And then as he walks down the sidewalk, he blows kisses back to her all the way till he gets to the car. Why don't you do that?" He said, "Well, honey, I hardly know the lady yet." You see, we're always trying to make somebody be like someone else. When you face a giant, assessment. What do I have? What can I do best? You're gifted. What gifts does God give? What has He given me? Just check that out. Think about it and write it down. Now, the third thing you see in verses 45 and 47 is the assurance. It is the assurance of what was going to happen. Going into battle, David already knew what the outcome was going to be. Now, let me tell you what assurance is composed of. First, it's composed of assumption. You can assume that, hey, God's put me here. God has me here for a reason, and I'm just going to be assured that God's going to give me the victory. You see, when the giant came at David, he said, "Oh, who is this little boy?" Let me tell you, before the sun sets, the birds of the air are going to come pluck the meat from his bones. Wouldn't that terrify you? Let me do what David did. He didn't let that bother him. Let me tell you what his assurance was. He said, "Just a minute, sir. Let me tell you first what he didn't say. He didn't say, 'Man, do you know how good I am with this slingshot? Do you know I'm on the Israeli Olympic team? I'm good. I can hit a rabbit at 100 yards. He didn't tell him what he could do. He told him where his strength was. In verse 45, he said, I have come in the name of the Lord. I've come in the name of the Lord. Now hear me very, very carefully. When you face a giant, if you go into it on your own gifts, and if you do it only on what you think you can do, then you're going to be defeated. But if God puts you in that situation, God will supply everything you need to be faithful and productive in that situation. In the name of the Lord. Now, if it's something you want for yourself that's greedy, you'll fail. If it's something you're going to do for God to fulfill His purpose in your life, it can be great. He said, I have come in the name of the Lord. Let me ask you a question. How many battles did God ever lose in this book? Now, sometimes people lose battles if they're coming in there for their own good. If you're just a greedy person, you can fall short. But look at the assurance. He said, I've come in the name of the Lord, and then look what he acknowledges. He says, this battle is the Lord's. It's not my battle. Sir, you don't understand. This battle is the Lord's, and I'm going to give it to him. You can be assured of that. Let me tell you something I've had a difficult time with in my life, is not saying, look, I want to learn, I want to study, I want to do better and conquer. You know what the Bible teaches? We conquer more when we discover our weakness. In fact, Paul said it's when I am weak. Now, I don't like that. Most of us don't want to be weak. But let me tell you, it's when we're weak that we can discover God's strength. And His strength comes most prevalent in our weakness. His grace, Paul said, is sufficient in our weakness. Now, weakness is not a bad thing. If we think we are arrogant and can do something ourselves, we can be defeated. But if instead we recognize what we can't do, ask God to do it, unbelievable things can happen. You might want to just discuss for a few minutes this whole idea of what does it mean to be weak and to find God's strength. Maybe just list some specific areas. Here's where I was weak, and here's where God gave me strength. Maybe just think about those and list those. I have come in the name of the Lord, and he said, this battle is the Lord's. Now, the fourth thing, you got the right attitude, you got the right assessment of what God's given you and gifted you. You've got the assurance of knowing that if God put you here, He's going to be victorious. Now, the fourth thing is a tough one. It's the word action. Action. You have to act. Verse in 48, when that giant came and faced young David, he had one or two choices. He could either act, or he could run in the opposite direction, or he could just sit there and think about it. Now hear me carefully. If you look at a giant long enough, it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. If you just sit and think about it, it'll get bigger and bigger. These some tough giant big ones we're facing. If you spend a lot of time on social media and just watching the news and all the stuff that's being written about the pandemic and about the coronavirus, I mean, that is bad. It's real and it is bad. But let me tell you, if you focus all on that and just look at it, then it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. I remember in my junior high school, I loved athletics, and I went out and we played football, and we played in the 7th grade against another team out in the county. And I remember when we went out there and these guys came walking on the field, I never seen such big 7th graders. I think a couple of them had mustaches. And I mean, they were big. And I was just sitting there looking at it. I'll never forget, the coach came over to me and said, John Ed, what you looking at? I said, well, those big boys. He said, let me tell you, The longer you stand here and look at them, the bigger they'll get. But come on, get ready and let's go play them. And when we played them, they weren't nearly as big. Now, let me tell you about a giant. The longer you just sit and study it, think about it, the bigger it'll get. But David acted. There comes a time when we need to quit analyzing and start acting. In verse 48, it says, he ran quickly. A part of action is aggressive. You got to be aggressive against the giant. Now, a lot of us might run, but we might run in the opposite direction. It says that he ran quickly. Now, quickly means he didn't just sit around and keep looking. He ran quickly. And look at his aim. Action has to have an aim. His aim was toward the Philistines. The Philistine. He ran toward the giant. Let me tell you a practical thing. Don't just sit and study it. Run towards the giant. Go towards it. If you sit around and just talk, somebody said if the solutions to all potential problems must be solved before we start, then we'll never begin. And sometimes just overthinking. Overthinking is just an exercise that creates problems that don't exist. Sometimes people use a term paralysis by analysis. And that's all right to analyze, but it comes a time where we have to then act. The time comes where we act. And so then let me just give you the fifth thing. You got the attitude. You've got the assessment of who we are. You got the assurance that this is God's battle, not mine. I'm coming in his name, and I'm going to act. Let me say a word about acting. Now, hear me carefully. Pray about it. But sometimes there comes a time where we need to quit praying and act. Sometimes praying can be a substitute for acting. Now, I believe in praying completely. But some folks would just rather pray all the time about something and never do anything about it. You can pray for somebody that's in need and pray and pray and pray. Sometimes you need to get up and go give them some food or clothes or what they need. Prayer is powerful, but prayer ought to lead us to action. Maybe just think a minute, what in your life have you faced, but you're still thinking about it? You're still analyzing it. You're still studying it. You're still talking with people about it. Write it down. Write it down. Where is it that God wants to lead you to step up and to move forward? Well, then we come to the last thing, and I love this. It is what I call the accomplishment. The accomplishment. He became victorious. In verse 50, let me tell you about an accomplishment. When God does something that's awesome. It is awesome. God does things that are miraculous. It's off the chart of what he can do. Look what it says in verse 50. David prevailed with a sling and some stones. Now, who would have ever thought that? Who would have ever given odds that David had a chance on that? But David prevailed. The accomplishment was awesome. Unbelievable, out of the realm of what we might even think as possibilities. David prevailed with a sling and with some stones. Let me tell you, would you just write down and maybe discuss as a group for a few minutes? What are some of the accomplishments you've seen? Some of them might be small, some might be medium, some might be really large. But count your blessings. Count your accomplishments. It's awesome. David prevailed with a sling and some stones. And then in verse 50, guess what? It says that all the Philistines fled. They ran. They got out of there. David had saved. Because you see, God helped him place a stone in the one place that he was unprotected. And the 9-foot giant fell. And David prevailed. Now, let me ask you, are you facing any giant that's bigger than Goliath? Is God ready to say, look, let me show you. Look, let's act. Let's go forward. I want to show you what you can accomplish. Now, we got giants in life. I hope maybe you'll spend some time now discussing, studying. I hope you'll give some personal reflection. I hope you'll make some notes, not to share with anybody else, but just yourself, looking at these questions and being honest. What giant am I facing? How am I going to face it? 5 simple steps: your attitude, your assessment, your assurance, your action, and your accomplishment. And I just want to give you some good news. I've got the assurance that there's no giant that you will face that with God's help and the power of His Holy Spirit that you can't be successful in overcoming. I've already read the last chapter of this book, and I know who's going to win. And over again, the prophets and the people kept telling the people of God, listen, be faithful, obey, follow God, and you will be victorious. I do several things. In fact, every day I do a brief devotional, 58 seconds. It's on a lot of radio stations. You can, actually we do it with a podcast. You can just, if you sign up for it, you can get it every morning. And it's 58 seconds. It sort of starts the day. I used one this past week about a father that walked in and his son was watching a ball game on TV, and the father didn't know much about sports, and he said, who's winning? He said, well, we're behind 28-0. He said, oh, your team's not doing very well, is it? He said, well, we're struggling. He said, well, you don't have any chance of winning then. The boy said, oh, I think we can win. And the dad said, oh no, I would bet anything that you're going to lose. And the boy said, Dad, I'd be willing to bet you anything that we're going to win, because this game is a replay, and I already know what the score is going to be. Hey, I got some good news for you. I've already read the last chapter. I know what the score is going to be. I know what God has in store for all of us. Now, how do you face a giant? Together, talk about these things. Trust God, and then go out and act. And I pray that we'll see some giants begin to fall. There's some resources that you can use. I mentioned about, you can just go on my website. It's my name, John Ed Mathison. I do that daily thing with early every morning. You get it about 6:30 every morning. I also every morning at 10 o'clock do a brief good news. Very brief. It's just in these days we need some good news. I do a blog each week that you can sign up for and receive on Wednesday mornings. I do a video once a week called Got a Minute. It comes in on Monday morning. There's several thousand people that watch all of these. I'd invite you just to be a part of it. You might find something to be very helpful in helping you with life. Hey, we're going to do some more of these, and I thank you for this privilege of letting me share in this time together with you.